as you know, tonight we're starting a new series, and the new series is in the book of Daniel, and the best recent book on the book of Daniel is this book right here by John Lennox. If you haven't picked this book up, I'd highly recommend you do. It comes in Kindle. As you can see, it's quite a big read, but it's a very good read, and Lennox is a wonderful guy. I've had the opportunity to work with him a little bit, had him over the house. This is about 1.5 years ago. And if everybody was like John Lennox, the entire world would be Christianized today, because this guy is so likable and so brilliant, and it's so charming. Just a wonderful guy, and he has some great insights on the book of Daniel. And this book goes through every chapter, and it gives you the whole structure of the book, and it really applies it to today. How does the book of Daniel apply to us today? Now, those of you who are Bible students know that the book of Daniel is in the Old Testament. Daniel is a prophet and also an historian. And the overview of the book of Daniel is basically in 2 parts. The first 6 chapters deals with Daniel's ministry in Babylon. Now, why would a Jew be in Babylon? Because they were exiled to Babylon, as you know, in about 600 BC. In fact, Daniel's exile was in about 605. Then there was a much bigger exile in about 586 when the Babylonians completely destroyed Israel and destroyed the temple. The second half of the book, chapters 7 through 12, deals with Daniel's vision of the future. Some of what he envisioned was short-term future. In other words, it's already happened. Other aspects of this section of Daniel has still yet to happen. So he's prophesied about events that have since happened, since his day, and there are other events that are really dealing with the end of all time, like the final resurrection. So Daniel is an historian and a prophet. Now let's just take a quick look at the first 6 chapters just to kind of give us an overview. Daniel is in Babylon, and he spends most of his life there. He is probably maybe 15, probably somewhere between 15 and 20 when he's taken from Judah and he's exiled to Babylon with some of his friends. So he's a very, very young man. He spends, as best we can tell, the rest of his life there. And he lives probably to 80, maybe 90 years old, somewhere in there, but he never, I don't think he ever gets back to Judah when he's exiled, after he's exiled to Babylon. Here are the first 6 chapters, and you're going to recognize some phrases because many of the phrases or idioms that we use in our language today actually come from the book of Daniel. Chapter 1, Daniel does not want to defile himself, and some people now call that the Daniel diet. Have you heard of the Daniel diet? There's books written about it. In fact, Rick Warren and others have put out books. What is the Daniel diet? Chapter 2 deals with interpreting King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And that's a very exciting chapter, and we'll get to that next time. We're going to do chapter 1 today. But his dream, in Daniel's day in Babylon, they had magicians and they had people who were supposed to be astrologers who supposedly were to interpret dreams of the king. And as you'll see when we get to chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he calls his astrologers and magicians in and says, "I'd like you to interpret the dream." And they all go, "Great, that's what we do. That's what you pay us for. What's the dream?" And he goes, "I'm not telling you what the dream is." Uh-oh. You got to tell me what the dream is and then what the interpretation is. If you're really all that smart and you really have all these skills, tell me what the dream was. And then he calls Daniel in, and we'll get to it next week. Chapter 3 is idolatry and the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the furnace. You've all heard this. Even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard about this. Being thrown into the fiery furnace. That's what chapter 3 is about. Chapter 4 is King Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. He actually goes mad for a period, and he actually converts to belief in God. And in fact, much of what we read in chapter 4 is written by Nebuchadnezzar himself. Chapter 5 is the handwriting on the wall. We use that phrase all the time. Oh man, we could see the handwriting on the wall. Man, if he couldn't see the handwriting on the wall, he's blind. The handwriting's on the wall. What's the handwriting on the wall? You'll see when we get there. But that phrase is taken directly from an incident in the book of Daniel. And then, of course, chapter 6 is Daniel in the lion's den. Wow, man, we were in the lion's den there, weren't we? Well, that guy goes right into the lion's den. That comes from the book of Daniel. Now, the theme of Daniel, what do you think the theme of Daniel is? What's the overall theme of the book? Anyone have any idea? Go ahead, Mike.
He didn't compromise.
He certainly didn't compromise. That's certainly part of it. But why didn't he compromise? He trusted God. Yeah, Dave?
I was going to say, he never lost faith or confidence in God.
He never lost faith or confidence in God. But what is Daniel trying to tell us about God in the book?
That he'll never give up on his people?
Well, that's true. He won't give up on his people.
Faithful.
He's going to be faithful. Despite what the circumstances may seem, God is sovereign. God is sovereign. That's the theme of the whole book. No matter that, Nebuchadnezzar just destroyed the temple and has taken us to Babylon. Actually, he destroyed the temple about 20 years after he took Daniel and his friends to Babylon. But why are we in Babylon if God is God? Why didn't we beat Nebuchadnezzar? How did he beat us? God is sovereign. So the application, if God is sovereign, so you better stand. You better stand with God because God is sovereign. Despite what the circumstances may seem, God is sovereign. And those who trust in him will ultimately find fulfillment in him. Whether it's in this life or the next, ultimately you're going to be with God if you trust in him. If you don't trust in him, he won't force you into heaven against your will. So that's the overall theme, and we'll see that occurring over and over again as we go in the book. So let's start right in chapter 1. If you got a Bible, you might as well just open to the book of Daniel, chapter 1 and verse 1. And as we do that, we'll get the context. Here is the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, I'm putting in here, it's 605 BC, just so you have the time. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. In fact, we know he besieged it. Jeremiah actually talks about it, and there are secular writers that talk about this. And in fact, as we'll see here in a minute, Nebuchadnezzar was fighting Egypt, and Palestine, Israel, was kind of on the way, so he took care of them too. And it says, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his, meaning Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. So some of the articles from the temple Nebuchadnezzar took in 605 BC. Later, in 586, 587, 586, he destroyed the temple. But right now he's just taking some stuff from it. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Now that's foreshadowing something. Why? Because later on when you get into chapter 5, those very vessels that he took are used by a descendant, a later king in Babylon. And as we'll see, once he uses those, that's where the handwriting in the wall comes in, and he pays dearly for defiling or using these holy vessels for his merriment. Now, one point I want to draw out here, you see this word Lord? In the Hebrew, that doesn't mean Yahweh. The Hebrew word is Adonai, and that Hebrew word actually means that the Lord is the owner or the sovereign or the ruler. So he's telling us, a Hebrew reading this would know, oh, he's using Adonai, which means the sovereign. Not a God, the God. God is sovereign. So the God delivered the Jewish king into the hands of the Babylonian king. That's what he's saying. God allowed this to happen. He delivered him into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Now let's take a look at the geography here, because the geography is important. Everything you see in red here are the current political boundaries. So you'll see Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, this is Iraq, as you know, Syria, Jordan, Turkey's up here. This is now present-day Iran. But if you look at the black lettering, the black lettering is the ancient names for some of these places. So let's look at some of these places that you may recognize. Babylon, that's where we're talking about now. That is where Daniel and his friends are. They were taken to Babylon. And as we'll see here in a few minutes, Babylon was probably the biggest city in the world at the time. Carchemish. This is a place that Jeremiah says that Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians. And there's secular sources on this as well, that Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians up here. And of course, Egypt is trying to control this area as well. After he beats the Egyptians here, he comes down to Jerusalem and handles the Israelites, or Judah at the time, and he installs his own kings there. In fact, I think Jehoiakim, the guy we talked about earlier, was installed by Nebuchadnezzar. And then a couple of kings later, I think it's Zedekiah, he's the last king of Judah. He's put there by Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar, Zedekiah decides that he is going to now side with Egypt and try and get protection from Egypt. Of course, Jeremiah says, don't do that, but he does it anyway. What do you think Nebuchadnezzar says about that? That's not going to stand. He comes down to Jerusalem. Zedekiah tries to get away, as Jeremiah tells us, but Nebuchadnezzar's forces capture him, kill his sons in front of him, and take his eyes out, and then bring him back to Babylon, where he lives the rest of his days. These guys were pretty brutal. All right. Iran, this is called Media up here. Here's Tehran, this capital of present-day Iran. But this is called Media, and the Medes and the Persians get together later, and they take over the Babylonian Empire later. We'll get to that later on in Daniel. Of course, you know Egypt is pretty prominent in the Bible. This is the Egyptian area. As you can see, the yellow is the Assyrian Empire, and the kind of the more pinkish in this area is the Babylonian Empire. So Babylon actually gets in and takes over Egypt, or at least parts of Egypt. Let's zoom in a little bit more. Here's Babylon. This is where they are. This is where the battle was that Nebuchadnezzar had with the Egyptians. Okay, so you're getting an idea of the basic geography. Now, if you wanted to go from Babylon to Jerusalem, or vice versa, from Jerusalem to Babylon, how would you get there? Yeah, you're going to follow the river. You're going to go this way or this way. You're not going to go this way. Why not? It's desert, right? You're not going to make it. This is why a lot of times people will say, they'll try and read the Old Testament and they'll try and say, armies will come from the north, which is what the Bible says. Oh, you know what's to the north? Russia's to the north. That's got to be Russia. No. I mean, it could be, but why do you come from the north? Because you're not coming from the east, because your army wouldn't make it. All right? You're not going to come across the desert. You're going to go the water route to get there. So anybody that's going to attack Israel isn't going to attack Israel from the east. They're going to attack Israel from the north. Difficult to attack from the south as well, because that's desert as well. And of course, to the west, you got a sea. So anybody that's going to try and take over Israel is probably going to come in from the north. Unless you're Egypt, then you may come in from the south. All right? Okay, so we got the basic geography now. Now, what was Babylon like? By the way, this is, I think, about 900 miles. So when they were exiled, they were taken from Jerusalem all the way to Babylon. They are a long way from home. And what was Babylon like? Obviously, we have no pictures, but we have some artist rendering. Babylon was a beautiful city, a jewel of a city. In fact, Babylon, it's been said, was probably the greatest city in the world at the time. You can see this is the Euphrates River going through it. This is a ziggurat, which is one of the temples to Marduk, which was their primary god. And this is the Ishtar Gate. I'll tell you about that here in a minute. But you can see, it just looks like a beautiful city. There are the Hanging Gardens right there. You may have heard of the famous Babylon's Hanging Gardens. Now, obviously, they don't remain now. In fact, we'll see here in a minute what current-day Babylon looks like. But the Hanging Gardens were put in by Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar married a woman from Media, northwest Iran. I've been there, and it's a beautiful area, mountains, got some greenery, and she wanted some greenery. So Nebuchadnezzar said, well, we'll bring it to you. So he built these beautiful hanging gardens in Babylon so she would feel more at home. Nice guy, right? He's trying to take care of his wife. The wife is nesting, and he wants to make sure she stays in the nest. Now, this is the famous Ishtar Gate. Ishtar, one of the goddesses of Babylon. This is actually in a building. It's in a museum in Germany. Why? Because a German archaeologist went there in the early 1900s, excavated the whole thing, and brought it back to Germany. And the Iraqis are saying, that's our gate, man, we want that back. Germans are saying, well, it's here, we dug it up. In fact, yeah, Auf Wiedersehen, that's right. 9 is what they said. In fact, as you know, there's a lot of artifacts in other museums outside of Iraq. For example, Turkey has some of the artifacts. Certainly the British Museum has many of the artifacts. Why? Because the Brits send all these archaeologists over there, and they just take the stuff and bring it back to Britain. In any event, a beautiful gate, and if you zoom in on this gate, you will see these beautiful depictions, these reliefs of animals. Of course, a lion, Daniel in the lion's den. These have been unearthed, uncovered. In fact, let me see where this one, I think this may be also in the museum there in Germany. And in fact, that Ishtar Gate is depicted in this particular drawing right down here. And this processional was an area where every New Year's they'd have this big kind of celebration to Marduk, the god, the supreme god of Babylon, and the king would have to be a part of this. And as we see later, we'll get into a dual reign where you had a father and a son reigning, and the father leaves Babylon and goes to somewhere in current-day Saudi Arabia and stays there for like at least 10 years, and everyone's wondering why. Well, it's because he had at least it's thought that the reason he left town is because he didn't really like Marduk. He had his own god, the moon god, and he wanted to pay homage to the moon god. But if you're in Babylon and you don't give homage to Marduk, that's going to be a problem. So he put his son in charge, co-regency. He goes down to Saudi Arabia. And that's why later on you hear that Daniel, for what he has done, is given the third highest office in the land. Why the third highest office, people are always asking. Why not the second? Because the king himself in Babylon was only the second. His father was exiled, or self-exiled, to a town in current-day Saudi Arabia. Also, as you can see here, this is a reconstruction of bricks with cuneiform characters found near the remains of the Ishtar Gate, and it actually has Nebuchadnezzar's name on it and why he actually built the gate. I'm not going to tell you the whole building inscription there, but it starts out this way. I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the faithful prince appointed by the will of Marduk, and then it goes on for a couple of paragraphs. Why did he build this gate? So they reconstructed this. I believe this is also in Germany, this magnificent gate. They put it all together, and they translated it all. And so Nebuchadnezzar himself has been found all over ancient Babylon. So this character that we read in the New Testament is not some fictional character, in the New Testament, the Old Testament, it's not some fictional character made up by Daniel. This is a known figure in history. In fact, 9/10 of the bricks found in Babylon have Nebuchadnezzar's name on them. His name is everywhere. It's like he owned the brick company. Nebuchadnezzar brick, Nebuchadnezzar brick, Nebuchadnezzar brick, right? It says, the name and titles of Nebuchadnezzar II are inscribed on this clay brick in both cuneiform and Aramaic scripts. The king of Babylon was responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. And so you find these, this is actually in the British Museum, you find these bricks all over the place with Nebuchadnezzar's name on them. So Nebuchadnezzar is a real person who thought quite highly of himself, obviously, right? You might say today, some guy builds a building. Maybe Trump, he builds a building. Every brick has his name on it, right? Well, the same thing is true here. Now, why Nebuchadnezzar II? His father was not named Nebuchadnezzar. Why is he called Nebuchadnezzar II? Well, about 600 years prior, there was another Nebuchadnezzar. And I don't know, maybe this guy just said, I like that guy. I'm going to be Nebuchadnezzar too. So he just named himself Nebuchadnezzar too. This is actually an engraving inside an onyx stone eye in a Marduk statue that depicts Nebuchadnezzar II. So this is apparently what Nebuchadnezzar II looked like. This guy lived 2,600 years ago. Yet there's archaeological evidence of what he looked like, at least a depiction of it. And this, by the way, is supposedly Marduk. This was their supreme god. There were many gods in Babylon, but Marduk was the supreme god. All right. In fact, Marduk is even spoken about in the scriptures. This is from Jeremiah 50 now. We're jumping ahead to Jeremiah 50. And here's what Jeremiah says about Marduk in Babylon. This is the word of the Lord spoke through Jeremiah the prophet concerning Babylon and the land of the Babylonians. Announce and proclaim among the nations, lift up a banner and proclaim it. Keep nothing back, but say Babylon will be captured. Bel, which is another word for Marduk, will be put to shame. Marduk, filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame and her idols filled with terror. A nation from the north, there it is, it's Russia. No, not necessarily. A nation from the north will attack her and lay waste her land. Who is the nation? Turned out it was the Medes and the Persians, present-day Iran, coming from the north down in about 539 BC. So Jeremiah is predicting this. By the way, this is actually a ridicule when this word idols is used here. If you translate it literally, it means dung pellets. Dung pellets. Cow patties, if you will. Yeah. Or other name. Another name you might think of. Another word you might use for such refuse. That's basically what Jeremiah is saying. These idols are nothing. They're dung. They're not real gods. They're dung. And so Babylon is going to be judged. This is what Jeremiah is predicting. Now, what does Babylon look today? That magnificent city. Actually, this is about 100 years ago. It says, the ruins of Babylon uncovered by the Europeans between 1900 and 1912. One of those Europeans was a guy from Germany who found the Ishtar Gate and brought it back to Germany. But as you can see, there's a man standing right here. So this is a picture from about 100 years ago, 1913 actually. And here's what it looks like today. Actually, these are United States soldiers in 2003 approaching the redone Babylon that Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild. He never finished it. In fact, the Bible says after it's destroyed, it will never be rebuilt. So far, so good. Okay? He tried to rebuild it and didn't finish it. In fact, here's a Humvee right here, as you can see, driving along. And this is kind of a view of the ruins of Babylon. These are called tells when they're big mounds of stuff. And if an archaeologist was there, an archaeologist would be digging in the tell to try and figure out what was under there. Because, as you know, when cities are destroyed and then someone comes in to try and rebuild the city, they don't clear all the debris away. They just kind of build right on over it. And they take some of that debris and just keep building, and that's why you get mounds built up. And so this is actually from Saddam's, this road here is from Saddam's summer palace, and this was Saddam's summer palace. No, not this down here. This up here, okay? And of course, we took that over when the United States went in there. And so this is the Euphrates River, right? He's trying to was trying to build a summer palace in the area. So that's present-day Babylon. Now, present-day Babylon is about 59 miles south of current-day Baghdad. Okay, that's geography. You saw it on the map earlier. Let's go back to the text now. Let's go back to the text. We know the kind of the overall context as to where we are. Let's go now to verse 3. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, got to be handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. So he's looking for the best of the best from Judah to come, and he wants to assimilate them into the Babylonian way of life. And this king was to, or this chief official was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So they're trying to assimilate, Nebuchadnezzar wants to assimilate these young men, these exiles from Israel, from Judah, into the Babylonian culture. He wants the best of the best and then basically put them to work for him. So the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, why would he give him new names?
Change the identity.
Change the identity. What was their identity?
Jews. They were Hebrews, probably.
Yeah, they're Hebrews, they're Jews. He's trying to assimilate them in and basically have them become loyal Babylonians. Now, there are 5 great questions in life. 5 great questions. And the 5 great questions are: what is our origin? What's our identity? Is there any meaning to life? How should we live then? In other words, what's our morality? And then ultimately, what's our destiny? Every worldview has to answer those 5 questions. Where did we come from? Who are we? Is there any real meaning to life, or do we just make it up as we go? It's just subjective rather than objective. Or is there real meaning? How should we live? What are our moral values? And then ultimately, where are we going to wind up? What's our destiny? These are the 5 questions. And chapter 1 of Daniel deals a lot with identity. And of course, all that flows, they all flow together. I mean, if our origin, in today's day and age, our origin is thought to be just the slime, the primordial slime, well, if that's the case and we're not made in the image of God, nothing else follows here, right? Our identity is we're just overgrown germs. There is no ultimate meaning to life. There is no ultimate right way to live it. Do whatever you want. Destiny, we're going to become worms again. Or we're going to become dirt again. On the other hand, if we are made in the likeness and image of God, then we do have an identity, an objective identity in him. There is true ultimate meaning to life. That's to know God and to make him known. There is a right way to live life, and there is an ultimate destiny. And the ultimate destiny is we're either going to be with God or we're not. Those are the only 2 in the end. So identity is what Daniel 1 is really dealing with. Now, you may have heard this phrase, what's in a name? Yeah, what is in a name? Well, Daniel's name actually meant God is my judge. Wow, imagine going to Babylon with a name, God is my judge. What do you think the Babylonians are thinking? Whew, you must have done something wrong, bro. You got booted out of your country, or you actually were kidnapped out of your country, and your country one day is going to be overrun by us. Your God's not happy with you. You must have done something wrong. It also, of course, gives the true impression that God is really involved in your life. God is my judge. God's not some being out there that has no interest in what we're doing or has no relationship with us. God has an intimate relationship with us and does have an interest in what we're doing. So God is my judge is what the word Daniel, or the name Daniel, actually means. Hananiah actually means Yahweh is gracious. Yahweh is gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. In other words, is there any other God like Yahweh? No. Who can be like Yahweh? Yahweh is the God. Yahweh is the sovereign. Yahweh is the ultimate being. Who is like Yahweh? No, it's a rhetorical question, right? Nobody. He's distinct. He's the ultimate being. And Azariah meant Yahweh has helped. Ooh, that's another bad one if you're in Babylon. How has Yahweh helped you, dude? You've been taken from your country. You're with us now. That God isn't very strong. So if they didn't know that Yahweh was the true God, they might be embarrassed by these names, wouldn't they? Because if we're going to have the common view that whenever you do right, God's going to bless you. Whenever you do wrong, he's not. Every one of these guys is in there going, guess I'm dirt, man. Yahweh's not treated me very well. But what they're trying to do is, as some of you have already mentioned, is they're trying to assimilate these Jews through language. So, while Daniel's name is God is my judge, his new name, Belteshazzar, means Bel, protect this life. Marduk, same thing, protect this life. So now they're saying, now we're not going to call you Daniel anymore. We're going to call you Marduk, protect this life. So now Marduk is your God, essentially. That's what they're trying to get him to believe. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious, now means Shadrach, which means command of Aku, the moon god. The moon god is now commanding Shadrach, according to them. Mishael means God is what God is, or who is what God is, who is Yahweh, who can compare to Yahweh. Now, his new name, Meshach, means who is what Aku is. At least we think that's what it means. There is some dispute, but that's what some commentators say. It means who is what Aku is, the moon god. Yo, you think Yahweh's so good? Yeah, well, who is what Aku is? Try that on. He's your new god. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. The new name, Abednego, means servant of Nebo. That's the son of Marduk. That's the son of Marduk. Now, by the way, have you ever tried to figure out what your name means? Because usually names mean something. I told my wife, my name is Frank. It means servant of the Holy One. Your name is Stephanie. It means make me a sandwich. She didn't buy it, right? She did not buy it, okay? Don't try that at home. It won't work, okay? So, they could change their names, but they could not change their identities. They wanted to change their identities by changing their names, but it turned out that these four gentlemen would not have their identities changed just because their names had been changed. Now, I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're 15 years old, you're yanked out of the United States by an enemy of the United States, you're taken to a foreign country. Would you stand like these four gentlemen stood? These four young men stood? Or would you allow yourself to be assimilated into this new culture? Say it's Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Russia or whatever it is. How would you respond? How would your son respond if he's of that age? Is he grounded enough, or she grounded enough? A daughter grounded enough in Christ to stand this kind of attempted assimilation? I have no idea what I would have done. You know, people always say, "I'll never deny Christ." Yeah, don't try that. Peter tried that, right? We never know what we're going to do under pressure until it happens. What are we doing now? With the light persecution we have now in the United States, extremely light. Are we keeping our heads down?
What about Oregon? The shooting in Oregon.
Yeah, the shooting in Oregon. Now, that's obviously a very isolated incident. But yeah, some people said, yeah, I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
They did that at Columbine and also Charleston.
They did that at Columbine and Charleston, perhaps, yes. I don't know. I honestly don't know what I would do. I hope I do the right thing, but I can't stand up here and say I know what I do. What would you do? What are you doing now? Under a lot less pressure. Are you already caving? Now, the power of language is very strong. Have you ever heard this? A lie told often enough becomes the truth. Have you heard this? This has been attributed to many of the tyrants. Lenin, not John Lennon, Vladimir Lenin, or the Russian leader. It's been attributed to Hitler. It's been attributed to his propagandist, Goebbels. Nobody can really trace the quote down. We're not exactly sure, but it seems to be a truism, right? Now, we don't literally mean that a lie told often enough becomes the truth. What we really mean is a lie told often enough will make people think it's the truth, right? They'll believe it.
Kind of like today's politicians.
Yes, kind of like today's politicians. I was at SMU and somebody asked me a question about politics, and I said, look, politics is just the choice between a known witch and a suspected devil, right? I mean, we think we're going to get somebody who's going to solve all the issues, but they're not. But in any event, a lie told often enough becomes the truth. What are some of the lies told in our culture right now? Through words, through language. Let's take let's take abortion. Let's start right there. Do you know the words that the pro-abortion people use? They use words like choice and reproductive rights. They're so positive sounding words. But we've seen the choices that are being made, and they involve literally tearing babies apart and then selling their body parts. Is that a choice? When people say, I have the freedom to choose, my question is, freedom to choose what? Tearing babies apart? You don't have the freedom to choose the life or death of somebody else. I'm pro-choice before intercourse, not after the baby's been conceived. Ronald Reagan famously said, I've noticed all those in favor of abortion are already born. How about gay? 40 years ago, gay meant happy. That word has been adopted by the so-called gay rights movement, the homosexual movement, and it's a positive word. The rainbow is supposed to be a positive symbol. And yet we've bought into this idea. People always say, oh yeah, my brother-in-law is gay. I don't like to use that terminology. Why? Because nobody's gay or straight. Not by action. Or I should say, not by identity. They are by action, right? They may act in a homosexual way or a heterosexual way, but your identity is not tied up in what your sexual desires are, nor your sexual behavior. Your identity is you are made in the image and likeness of God, in the sense that you have mind, emotion, and will, like God has. And you have that in a capacity no other creature that we know about has. Animals don't have mind, emotion, and will in the same sense we have it. We're made in the image and likeness of God. That's why we're moral beings. So your identity is not gay or straight. Your identity is you're made in the image of God. When people say they're gay, what they're trying to say is, I have no choice about this. Well, you may have no choice about your desires or your attractions, but you certainly have a choice in your actions. And your desires don't define you. If your desires define you, then you're a murderer because you've thought about that. Then you're an adulterer because you've thought about that. You're a thief because you've thought about that and probably have done it like I have. We've all stolen something at some point, right? If that defines what you are, then we're all sunk. Of course, we are all sunk anyway because we've thought about it and in some cases we've done it. But this is not an identity. But we use words to try and make it seem like an identity. How about inclusion and diversity? What does that mean in today's day and age? They're positive sounding words, but they don't really mean inclusion and diversity. I found out personally, as you know, because I was actually, I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but I was actually fired from a company, Cisco and Bank of America, in the name of inclusion and diversity because I had written a book against same-sex marriage. So I was excluded in the name of inclusion and diversity. You see, this doesn't really mean diversity. It means you see it our way or we will hurt you. That's what that means. This is the new absolute. They think they're getting rid of absolutes? No, they're just putting in a new absolute. The new absolute is you have to see sexual license like we see it. And if you don't see it that way, you're out. That's not inclusion. That's not diversity. You got to see it our way, one way. It's exact opposite of inclusion and diversity. But the words sound good, don't they? Also, tolerant. That's a word that's thrown around. What does tolerance traditionally mean? What does it mean?
To accept, put up with, that you put up with somebody else who's different from you.
You put up with their ideas and their right to have ideas that are contrary to you, but you don't tolerate everything they want to do. You can't be a just society if you tolerate what anybody wants to do at any time. In fact, if you tolerate evil, then you're unloving. See, Christians are not commanded to be tolerant. We're commanded to be loving. Tolerance is too weak. Tolerance says, hold your nose and put up with them. Love says, reach out and help them. And the only way to help people sometimes is to not tolerate the evil that they want to do. I mean, we know this as parents or former children. We're all former children ourselves, aren't we? Right? If your parents tolerated everything you wanted to do, would they be loving parents? No. You can't tolerate evil. If you tolerate evil, you're actually unloving. And of course, I've noticed that the people who say they're fighting for tolerance are the most intolerant people out there. In the name of inclusion and diversity, you're out.
Well, tolerance today only is one way, too.
Yeah, tolerance is one way. It's our way or the highway, which is intolerance. By the way, in order to be tolerant of somebody else, you by definition have to disagree with them. If you agree with them, that's not tolerance, that's agreement. And yet the other side is saying, if you don't agree with us, you're intolerant. No, the only way for me to be tolerant is to disagree with you. If I agree with you, then I agree with you. So language is used in such a way to distort the truth so you will somehow see things their way. Oh, you're a bigger, you're a hater, or you're a homophobe. You hear this all the time. I had a question at SMU a couple of weeks ago, Southern Methodist University, and some guy got up and said, well, are we supposed to be involved in politics? And I talked a little bit about that, and he said, I've been called a hater for having certain views. What do you say to that? I said to him, I said, look, if I'm a hater because I disagree with you, that would make you a hater for disagreeing with me, right? We're not necessarily hating people because we disagree with them. In fact, if we disagree with them, we may be disagreeing with them out of love because we don't want to see them get hurt or them hurt others. So this idea that you're a hater if you disagree with somebody, and now this is all over the media, right? Now the haters. You're the homophobes. You're the bigots. You're a bigot because you disagree? You might be, but not necessarily. In fact, I had a conversation with a homosexual activist once. He called me a bigot. I said, you don't even know why I hold the position I hold. I wrote a whole book on this and that you've never read. If anyone's a bigot, it's you. Because you're judging me without even knowing why I believe what I believe. If that's not bigotry, I don't know what is. So they're using words to try and get you to shut up and see it their way. This is what's going on today.
Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid also said if you disagreed with Obama that you were a racist.
Yeah, there's another one. If you disagree with President Obama, you're a racist. They don't say the same thing about Ben Carson, though, or Clarence Thomas.
Yep.
You notice that? It's quite interesting. If a black man holds liberal views, you're a racist if you disagree with him. If he holds conservative views, you're just wise if you disagree with him. See, it's a double-edged sword, and they only want to have one edge. They want it to go just one way. And then what they will also call you is unenlightened because they are enlightened. This is the enlightened view, the progressive view. No, it's the regressive view, unfortunately. Now, back in the days of Thomas Jefferson, liberalism was truly progressive. Let's progress toward some better values. Let's try and get rid of slavery, for example. Although Jefferson owned slaves, he knew it was wrong. That is a progressive view. But there's a point where you progress beyond boundaries, and now you're regressing. Now you're calling evil good and good evil. Now we're calling prayer evil. Now we're calling marriage between a man and a woman evil, and anyone who disagrees with that is evil. The world is upside down. As Isaiah said, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And whose fault is that? Yeah, that's our fault right here, because we have not been engaged enough. We've allowed all of the language assimilation to overcome our ability to resist. Why are we doing that? Someone put it this way: I'm going to be called names for being a Christian, my kids are going to be thrown in jail for being a Christian, and my grandkids are going to be martyred. You know why? Because we don't have the courage of Daniel. And we don't have near the amount of danger that Daniel had, as you'll see here in a minute. Let's go back to the text now. Daniel has been told that he's going to eat certain things and drink certain things. This is going to be the best stuff from the king. Hey, you're 900 miles from home. Who's going to ever know if your dietary restrictions are going to be violated? Why not enjoy? Here's what it says. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused, God is sovereign. God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Look, Daniel, dude, we're on a program here. It's a strict program. I can't allow you to avoid boot camp. You're being trained. You got to eat this stuff. You got to drink this stuff. You got to do as I say, because it's going to be my head if you don't make it. If you look worse. So what does Daniel suggest? We're not going to read it. It's all in the text. You can read it yourself. What does Daniel suggest at that point? Yeah. He says, give me 10 days. Just give me vegetables. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't eat meat, because meat is actually, you're supposed to eat the Passover lamb, right? God is not necessarily a vegetarian, and I certainly didn't work my way to the top of the food chain to be a vegetarian, okay? Nothing against vegetarians out there, but it's not commanded. Just because we have a description of what happened here doesn't mean that this is a prescription for everyone. In fact, why do you think Daniel probably didn't want to eat the meat? It could have been unclean, could have been pork of some kind, could have been sacrificed to idols. In fact, this is what happens in 1 Corinthians. The New Testament believers have the same issue. And that's why Paul in Romans 14 says, it's up to your conscience whether or not you want to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Now, obviously, it can't be all about it's unclean meat or it's sacrificed to idols, because he refuses to drink the wine. Now, there's nothing in the Hebrew Scriptures that says you can't drink wine, as long as it's done in moderation. You're not supposed to get drunk, but you can have wine. In fact, wine in the Old Testament is seen in many areas as a blessing. So why would he say no to the wine? Maybe because, again, this is used in idol ceremonies, and he didn't want to defile himself in any way. We're speculating a little bit here, but he just wanted to avoid it. He did not want to defile himself. So the question is, why is Daniel faithful after a God appears to abandon him and his country? You remember last week or a couple weeks ago when we talked about David and Ahithophel? For those of you who were here, that whole thing about David's right-hand man basically disowning him when Absalom rebels. And then David flees Jerusalem because he knows Absalom is coming to Jerusalem. And as he's leaving, There's a guy on the road who starts cursing at David, the king, and starts throwing rocks at him. And his guards say, "You want us to take this guy out, king?" He goes, "No, maybe the Lord told him to do it. I deserve this. I deserve this." You think Daniel may have thought, maybe we deserve to be exiled? Jeremiah's been preaching in the land about this. In fact, Jeremiah, this is a painting, 1600s painting of the siege of Jerusalem, which happened about 19 years later. You can see the city being burned in the back by Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah is warning Judah. Here's what he says. "For this is what the Lord says about the palace of the king of Judah. Though you are like Gilead to me, like the summit of Lebanon, I will surely make you like a wasteland, the towns not inhabited. I will send destroyers against you, each man with his weapons, and they will cut up your fine cedar beams and throw them into the fire. People from many nations will pass by this city and will ask one another, 'Why has the Lord done such a thing to this great city?' And the answer will be, 'Because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord their God and have worshipped and served other gods.'" That's why. He knew what Jeremiah was preaching. He knew that this had been predicted. Now, of course, this complete destruction hadn't happened yet, but he knew that there was judgment coming because they were not obeying. They were worshiping idols. In fact, Psalm 37 is a famous psalm. Psalm 37 is a famous psalm that starts out this way. "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." You can see him sitting along the banks of the Euphrates going, "Man, our homeland destroyed." You can just imagine they're sitting there on the sidelines just lamenting what has happened. Now, at this point, I want to jump to the New Testament for just a minute. The book of James, written by the half-brother of Jesus. And here's what he says toward the end of chapter 1. "This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world." Unstained by the world. Daniel wants to be unstained by the world. Question, are you unstained by the world? I can't say I am. Unstained by the world. 1 John says, "All that's in the world is the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life." Money, sex, and power. Are we unstained by those things? Daniel tried to remain unstained by his world that was around him. One more point. Remember last week, a couple weeks ago, we talked about Jesus before the Pharisees? I want to take another look at that. Now, here's what was said literally. "Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." Well, whose image is on the coin? Caesar. Said Caesar was divine. Well, they're not into idol worship. But the question is, whose image is on you? God's image is on you. So give to God what is God's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God's what is God's. God's image is on you. So don't miss the larger point here. You need to remain unstained by the world, not defile yourself. Just like Daniel didn't. By the way, what's the rest of the story with Daniel? What happens after he says, he basically runs a scientific experiment, doesn't he? He says, "All right, give us 10 days, and then you can check us out." What happens after 10 days? He looks better, and they're better, they're smarter, apparently, and Nebuchadnezzar says, "These guys are 10 times better than anybody else." Now, this text is not teaching that if you follow God, everything's going to go well for you. That's prosperity gospel nonsense. This is a description of what happened to Daniel. It may go better for you, but it might not. God is sovereign. This is a description, not a prescription. So don't take everything that's descriptive and make it prescriptive, because it isn't necessarily prescriptive. So the question is, where are we now? Whose image is on you? God's image. So your identity is in God. It's not your job. And I know as men, we always think our vocation is really who we are. And if we ever lost our vocation, it would hurt, obviously. But if you put your entire identity in a job, what happens when that job goes away? Do you go away? Some men, some do. Some kill themselves over this because they put all of their identity into a vocation, into a career, into a job. Your identity is not your sexual feelings. Your identity is not even who you're married to. Your identity is in God. And God is sovereign, so you need to stand. That's the message of Daniel. Now, Paul does say that the lessons from the Old Testament were written as examples for us. So we can take a look at what Daniel does and say, if he sets a good example, that might be a good example for us to follow. Well, it's not prescriptive, it's an example. We're not going to have necessarily the same results Daniel has, but if Daniel does good, that's an example for us to follow, regardless of what the results are. So are we really standing in our own lives, or are we allowing the world to defile us? That's the question only each one of us can answer for ourselves.